Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states. I have a secret. I used to struggle with dull, saggy skin. Then I found Spoiled Child's E27 liquid collagen. This extra strength liquid formula, packed with type 1 and type 3 collagen, vitamin C, and hyaluronic acid, makes it so easy to visibly transform your skin and hair. No more chunky collagen powders, just a smooth, delicious liquid that can be blended with any drink. With over 100,000 five-star reviews, this liquid collagen is going viral for a reason. And with their Try Before You Buy offer, you could try your full-size product at home before buying. Take the quiz at spoiledchild.com/quiz. That's spoiledchild.com/quiz.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and this is our 100th episode of the podcast. Cue sort of sound effects and Radio 1 style applause. Before we get started, I'd like to say some thank yous to a bunch of people. First of all, my family, Lydia, Alice and Rosaline, all of whom have had to put up with various inconveniences and absences in order to make this podcast possible. Lots of late dinners, for instance. They've been supportive, encouraging, and most importantly, they've taken the piss pretty constantly, never once allowing me to get above myself, which I think is an admirable trait in a family, what they are basically there for. I'd also like to thank Elliot Atkins, who has written the music especially for the podcast, and I think with its Carpenter-esque / Morricone feel, and yet it's all its own thing as well, of course. Elliot is one of my oldest friends, and he is a fellow film lover. Many of the films we watched together and argued about and joked about while we lived in Liverpool, and that continues to this day. I'd also like to thank my guests, of which there have been too many, 100 or so, to thank individually without leaving someone out, but they have all given their time and their expertise to provide me with a private film school that has taken me to places I've never been, or even favourite haunts but with new eyes. And finally, I have to thank my listeners, many of whom have basically provided the only promotion this podcast has had. I've met some of you in person at various festivals and venues. Others I've talked to or messaged with outside of Twitter. You've all always been amazing, a source of constant encouragement. I'd like to name in particular Andy and Joe English, Kai Ross, Jem Duduku, Christopher James, David Hughes, the cinematologists who have been very important in helping me out, Pamela Hutchinson, and many others. Please forgive me if I've omitted your name here, but it is only proof of how much support I've received over the last 2 years that listing everybody would just go on for over an hour, I'm sure. As regular listeners will already know, this was a lockdown-inspired project. It was only supposed to last for 10 episodes. But as long as the guests kept saying yes, and most importantly, great film books kept appearing, I felt there was no way I could stop, or indeed wanted to stop. In fact, I'm starting a new podcast, a second one, which will be available in the coming weeks. It's called Cinema Italia, or Cinema Italia, if I give it the proper Italian pronunciation, and will feature guests both from Italy and around the world talking about their favourite Italian movies, from the silents to the neo-realists to the spaghetti westerns and giallos, right up to the present day. Guests will include writers, filmmakers, actors, and will provide a panorama of the Italian cinematic scene. So hopefully you might consider subscribing to that podcast as well. 2 podcasts in 1 week? No way. Oh, go on. But before you do any of that, I had the chance to talk to Matt Zoller Seitz, a critic I've read and admired for years, a critic who has written many books on The Sopranos, Wes Anderson, and most recently Deadwood. He has also become an online source for buying books specifically which cover the arts, and of course a large slice of those are books to do with cinema. Many of our guests who have featured on the podcast have been promoted and sold on Matt's site. So I'll put the links in the show notes so you can visit his site and continue and support that as a very worthy venture. If you enjoy the podcast, please remember to like and subscribe, or not. It's the 100th episode. Why am I insisting on you doing things like this? You've liked and subscribed enough, I'm sure. So if you enjoy the episode, just keep on coming and enjoy the conversation.
Well, I think the first movie that kind of burrowed itself deep into me was Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And I was 9 years old. I was living with my brother, and I were living with our grandparents. Our parents had gotten a divorce. They lived in Dallas, and my grandparents lived in Kansas City. I didn't see too much of either of them. It's kind of a long story that I'll probably write a sad memoir about someday. But essentially, my dad came to visit me in November of 1977, which I believe was around the time that Close Encounters came out. And I already knew the entire plot of Close Encounters because I bought the bubblegum cards. And the bubblegum cards, they had every single thing that happened in it. So I knew everything that happened in it. But we went to see it, and I was obsessed with the mothership. And I'm sure looking back on it, it took me until I was, middle-aged to figure out, the kind of associations with that. I saw more of my dad than I did of my mom. And I think, this idea of this sort of man-child kind of heading to this place to be reunited with the mothership. It's you don't need to be a therapist to figure out what that's about. And I was a little kid, so of course I didn't think about movies in that way, but I'm sure that was a part of it. And it was really interesting because, the Fabelmans came out, and I understood my own obsession with Close Encounters in a completely new way as a result of the Fabelmans, when I found out that, there's a lot of stuff in the Fabelmans that is kind of a reference to things that happen in Close Encounters, including all the stuff with the train set. That movie is kind of an imaginative, I call it an act of imaginative empathy on the part of Spielberg, where he's trying to understand his mother needing to leave her family in order to be happy. And she wasn't happy with the family as much as she loved the family. She wasn't happy with them. Close Encounters, he kind of sort of puts the mother and the father together in the character of Roy Neary. It's sort of like Spielberg it's sort of I feel like it's him glomming together his own need to leave the family in Arizona to go off to Hollywood and seek this miraculous event, which turns out to be his own career. And his mother, who of course, did leave the family, just as the Fabelmans details. And it would be Close Encounters. There were other movies that I was really into prior to that, like the remake of King Kong with Jessica Lange, which I bought a Scholastic book about the making of it. That was the first making of book that I can ever remember reading. But it was Close Encounters. That was the one that really like got me right in the heart and in the mind. And that came out the same year as Star Wars. And I remember, of course, I was into Star Wars. I think you were legally not allowed to be disinterested in Star Wars at that time. But I remember even as a kid thinking that Star Wars didn't fuck me up in the way that Close Encounters did. Close Encounters was the first big Hollywood blockbuster, and it was a huge hit. It was one of the top films of the year, and it was on the cover of, I think, Newsweek. That was the first blockbuster that I remember feeling profoundly moved by, and I don't just mean in the sense of it gave me the feels, as the kids say, but also like I felt like something like my internal organs were being rearranged by having watched this movie. And I went back to see it several more times. But so that's my answer. I'm sorry it was so long.
Keep them as long as you like. As epic as the film itself. No, I mean, I remember my encounter with Close Encounters. I don't think it was on the cinema screen. I think because I was maybe just a little bit too young for Close Encounters. Although I did see Star Wars that year as the very first film I ever saw at the cinema.
Wow. How old were you?
I will have been about 5 or 6, I think. So pretty young. I'll have been dragged along with my brother as a sort of like, you can't leave him at home. If you're going to take Francis, you have to take John. That'll have been the conversation, I'm sure. But I have very strong memories of it. At least I have very strong memories of queuing up, of going in and the film had already started. So I saw the bit and I thought it was Steve McQueen. There's a guy with very blue eyes who's one of the rebels who gets killed by Darth Vader very quickly. And I thought, oh, Steve McQueen's in this. I was young.
You thought, oh, they killed Steve McQueen.
Yeah. in the very first scene. So I remember that, and I kind of after that, it's a mush of feeling. And I remember getting fish and chips on the way home. That was the whole, because it came to England in 1978. It was January 1978.
Right. Yeah. That sounds right. Yeah. It's really, this is your 100th episode? Is that right?
Yeah.
That's quite a milestone. That's quite a milestone. And I wanted to, before we go any further, I wanted to congratulate you on that and say what an honor it is to be a guest on your 100th podcast, considering the luminaries that you have had on here in the past. It's really a very impressive enterprise that you've got here.
Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate that. It's a really it's been a hell of a lot of fun. It's been a real privilege to talk to as you say, those luminaries, people I'd never dreamed I'd get an opportunity to talk to, and it's been a heck of an adventure, and long may it continue.
Well, absolutely, and you've had a lot of people whose work I admire a great deal on here, and who are just interesting people, and Dana Stevens and Charles Bramesco, both of whom I've hosted events with. Dan Mirvish, the filmmaker Dan Mirvish, who I think is really interesting. Like, he's really like, I have a soft spot for any filmmaker whose movies go, who the hell is the audience for this? All of his films fit that description, and I mean that with love and respect. Like, he doesn't seem like he has one eye on the box office at all. And yet there's a lot of substance and a lot of feeling there, and like he's kind of doing it old school.
Yeah, I love the fact that he's so into all aspects of the filmmaking process, from the very obviously the inception and the making itself, but also the promotion of it, and how excited he is when people get to see it.
How many times have you had George Stevens Jr. on? Twice? 3 times?
Twice.
So what is the fascination with George Stevens Jr.?
Well, initially it was he did this memoir, but I've been kind of from last year, from like February, I've been writing a book. From last February, sorry, I've been writing a biography of Terrence Malick.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I've had this idea of sort of crossing the beams, to use a Ghostbusters analogy badly, of sort of trying to get people onto the podcast who would also be willing to talk about Terry and give me some insight into someone who is otherwise a fairly mysterious figure, as I'm sure you'll know. And so he has been very useful to me, sort of in that regard, and he has been very and his book, when I read it, is just so fascinating. He's I mean, this guy has met every president. He's talked to every huge heroes in film. I mean, I think he lived on the same street as like Bing Crosby and Stan Laurel and people like that. Just like legends who we don't even think about sort of who go to pick up the mail at the end of the street or pick up the newspaper off their lawns. And that's he's growing up in that sort of environment. So, and of course, as the founder of the AFI, arguably one of the most influential people in American film.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and kind of a bridge between eras of Hollywood.
Yeah, exactly. So he's there with the 70s. He's there with people like David Lynch, is in the second year of the AFI Conservatory. And he's also there suggesting to his father that he should make Shane as a film. That's a pretty remarkable sort of stretch. I don't mean even further towards the present day in terms of, Barack Obama and I mean, he was producing The Thin Red Line as well.
And you interviewed Michael Benson, who's the author of what might be one of the best making of books I've ever read in my life, the book about 2001 Space Odyssey. And that's a book where, like, I'm such an evangelist for that book that I think people cross the street when they see me coming because they know I'm going to talk about Michael Benson's 2001 book. And wow, and so much stuff in there that you didn't know before. I didn't know before, certainly.
Well, I thought I am a huge fan of 2001. I would consider that's another film, even though I watched it on a sort of black and white portable television, was my first exposure to it. But that's a film I would consider one that absolutely changed my view of what was possible with cinema. And I think I'd read the Arthur C. Clarke's Lost Worlds of 2001, which was probably published relatively contemporary to the film coming out itself. And so reading Michael Benson's book, I thought, I'll know this. I know all of this, surely. And I didn't know, as you say, I didn't know 90% of it. And it really changed the way I viewed the film afterwards.
Yeah, the two of the biggest anecdotes for me in there were the fact that he originally wanted to show the alien or whatever the things were at the end of it, and he kept putting it off because he wanted it to be something that no one had ever seen before, and he couldn't get the special effects right. And also he ran into a conceptual problem, which is the human mind cannot conceive of something that does not exist, that has no connection to something that's already known. That's kind of a basic rule of creativity, and that's why no matter how unusual aliens are when you see them in the movies, they're always sort of reminiscent of things on Earth. Like they're furry, they're scaly, they're amphibians, they're octopi or whatever. And in the end, he just decided not to show it. And then the other one is the monolith. I love the anecdote about the monolith that it was originally I think a trapezoid or a pyramid. And they built it, and Frankenstein and Sons was the name of the prop company. I'll never forget that. What a name. And Frankenstein and Sons builds this, they say, we can't build a lucite pyramid. It's going to be too heavy. It's going to be too difficult to transport. Will you consider making it some other shape? And they decided to go with this kind of domino shape, which looks like a door, which turns out to be perfect for the movie. And he said, well, I wanted it to be transparent. And they said, well, we can't really do it out of glass. You'll never be able to keep it clean. And there's also the risk of, if it shatters, it could hurt someone. So why don't we try lucite? And they make it out of lucite, and it weighs a ton, literally, and they put it on a flatbed truck and take it to Kubrick's studio, and they prop it up, and he looks at it through the viewfinder, and he says, it looks like a big bar of soap. Take it away. And his producer says, look, we went to all this time and expense and trouble to get this thing in here. Is there something else we can do to it? Can we maybe paint it a different color? And Kubrick's like, I don't know, screw it, paint it black, whatever. And then they bring it back onto the set, and he looks at it, and he's like, oh my God, that's it. And it's just such a lesson, like, because I think there's this misperception that filmmakers like him so quote unquote have everything planned out in advance, and no, they don't. There's as much serendipity in a control freaks movie as there is in somebody who wings it.
One of my favorite stories from that book, I think, is in the reception of the film as well, where they have that disastrous New York premiere. And you could hear the banging of the seats as people are getting up to leave.
Well, I think it was Washington D.C. actually, and then he cut 20 minutes out of it or something like that.
He had like two running scenes, the running around the spaceship
scene, which is so striking and so amazing. He had like another one, which was about the same length. And people were like, after the first one, they were like, okay, we've seen this already. We don't need to see it again.
Well, I also love that this is an example of a thing that I talk about a lot, which is that great movies find their audience eventually. Eventually, they find their audience. And in the case of 2001, it found its audience a lot faster than anyone would have thought. It got mixed reviews. Everybody was impressed with the look of it and the visual effects, but a lot of people thought it was too obscure, too pretentious, too boring, too slow, too this, too that. I don't think that they thought that what was going to make the film a hit would be hippies taking drugs and going to see it, but that's exactly what happened. In fact, my own dad told me about that. I think he took psilocybin and went to see 2001 with my mother. and David Chase, the creator of The Sopranos, has talked to me about that. In 2000, he took drugs and went to see 2001 multiple times with the woman who's now his wife. And there was a lot of mind expansion going on. And after the film had been out for a while, they put out a new poster and it said "The Ultimate Trip" on the poster. Right, when that was why, because they were finding out that the real hardcore. The audience that was making this film one of the biggest hits of the year was it was not people in their 40s and 50s. It was people in their 20s.
Just that idea as well that it was this countercultural success when Kubrick himself doesn't strike me particularly as a countercultural figure, accepting, embodying sort of artistic freedom, I guess.
No, and yet he sort of did. He did in his own way, and I think he did it incidentally, just by as a byproduct of trying to make movies his way, and to the point of even moving to England in order to have more privacy and have kind of a bubble around himself, which carries its own drawbacks, I would suppose, but. Yeah, I love those kinds of stories, and I love this. I love the process. I love talking about the process and the way that the process informs what we see on screen. And I think it's interesting, and I think the form of a film is as important as the content. And as I'm sure you know, I get cranky when I see criticism that doesn't talk about content, doesn't talk about filmmaking at all, where it's like, these are not just delivery devices for messages which you can then pronounce as acceptable or socially unacceptable and write an op-ed about it. I mean, a lot of film criticism now is basically it's editorials. It's editorials and they use the movie as a jumping off point for their editorial. I'm a pretty left-wing guy, actually, and I'm certainly trying to be sensitive to all of that when I write, but there's more going on in art than the messages. And if it was only about the messages, you wouldn't need movies. You could just have the filmmaker could just send a PDF of the script to everyone. Like that's what it's about. And there's also the other related thing, which is that movies are a sensory experience, and they're about the effect of those images and the sounds and the music and the colors on you. And it's similar to, it's not just like, it is like reading a book, and it is like going to a play, but it's also like going to an art gallery or going to a concert and or a multimedia show or something, or a fireworks display. There's some movies that are basically fireworks displays. I would argue that probably half of the running time of any James Bond or Star Wars film is a fireworks display.
A series of controlled explosions.
That's right. And some fireworks displays are better done than others. I've been to some that were quite disappointing, and others that I couldn't even believe how awesome it was.
No, I think that's true. I used to have an old professor, Brian Nellis, who once berated me for some piece of sort of undergraduate sort of left-wing judgmentalism, I guess, and he said, "No, Bleasdale, life is wider than argument." And I just thought that is so true. There is so much that, because argument, you have to narrow it down to make your point. A point is a very reduced thing.
Yes.
And life isn't made of points. Life is made of waves.
No, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And also, what are this substrain of criticism where it's about is the behavior of this character acceptable or unacceptable? Who cares? Who cares? What's important is, does the movie endorse it? If the movie endorses it, if they show somebody behaving in a completely abominable way and the movie seems to be reveling in it, well, yeah, then I think you have a problem. But if it's merely presented and you're supposed to have your own reaction to it, and you know, I keep coming back to Scorsese, who I think virtually alone among big budget, serious adult filmmakers doesn't tell audiences how they're supposed to feel about things, and he gets it. I think one of the reasons Scorsese makes people so uncomfortable is he makes these movies about people who are, not all of them, you know, the religious films, often the main characters are exemplary human beings, but the crime films, they're not. And one of the things that he shows you is that these guys, at least to the people in their circle, are exciting. They're exciting. They enter the room and they bring an instability, a volatility, a chaos, an element of anything can happen that is very attractive to certain people, particularly people who don't really have a strong personality. And all that stuff is in the movies too. And whether it's Goodfellas, Casino, Mean Streets, The Wolf of Wall Street, The Departed, you see, you know, that whole kind of leader of the pack sort of thing that happens where all the guys fall in line behind whoever's the loudest and the scariest. You know, it's just like movies about drugs, like Trainspotting. Yeah, I know you did an episode about Trainspotting. It's, you know, one of the brilliant things about Trainspotting is it shows you how under certain circumstances, and particularly at the beginning of the experience, drugs are exciting. I mean, sometimes they're exciting in a horrible way because you don't know. It's like, am I gonna do something that's going to get me in jail or completely irreparably ruin my life? Like that's part of the appeal, is getting away with something and feeling that high and that rush, and then a few hours later or the next day, you're like, oh my God, why did I do this to myself? Alcohol has the same effect. And like, you know, I love movies like that. And some of my favorite television dramas are like that, where you're supposed to grapple with your conflicted response to the characters and the material. That's the entire point of it. And if the movie is just sitting here saying, bad, 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 these are bad people, they're so bad, aren't you glad you're not bad? Like, well, where's the art in that? You know, are we children?
Right.
Does everything have to be a teachable moment for an 8-year-old child to understand without help?
And I mean, it goes with I have sort of the thought experiment of could you allow for the fact that there is a film that you utterly agree with from a political point of view, but as a film is just completely tedious to you?
I've seen a million of them.
Exactly. And the flip of that, which is, you know, can you think of a film which is abhorrent to you politically, but you can't help but admire as a piece of cinema? It does something to you.
Well, probably, you know, a good percentage of all the great action films that have been made fall under that category for me, because I hate the fact that so much of cinema is glorifying law enforcement and particularly glorifying this idea that you can't really get justice for society unless you break the rules. And there was this entire, it's still going on after the Miranda decision, where suspects had certain constitutionally protected rights. There was this whole string of movies, and it was, some of them were cop movies and some were vigilante movies, but the entire point was the quote unquote liberal establishment was protecting criminals, which was not what was happening. I mean, they were ensuring certain minimum protections against the state, which had a legal monopoly on violence. And that was an entirely different thing. It's a little bit more hard to explain to a general audience, but movies like the entire Dirty Harry franchise, the Lethal Weapon movies, the French Connection, a lot of Stallone's films, Schwarzenegger's films, even Michael Douglas made a couple of them, where the whole point is, the scene where the cops get called into their commanding officer's office and reprimanded for not observing the suspect's rights, and they're like, well, he was in the middle of killing a bus full of children or something. Like, there's always some extreme example, and yet these are great movies. The French Connection's a great movie. The first Dirty Harry is a great movie. The first Lethal Weapon and parts of the others are superb. And, I could go on, but these are reactionary films. They're reactionary. Even Die Hard is pretty reactionary politically, not just in terms of like cops, but also marriage.
Now I've seen you shoot a bunch of people. I see what's, I'm going to take your name again.
Right, exactly. But you have to admire the absolute perfection of the way it's constructed, right down to the point where, the Holly was given a watch by the yuppie cokehead Hollis, who obviously had designs on her, and that watch symbolizes the pull of Los Angeles, of pulling away from the marriage, pulling her towards her career and away from her family. And the last thing that happens when she's, Hans is hanging on to her arm is, they click the little, the what do you call it on the wristband?
The clasp.
The clasp, thank you. And the clasp, the watch, relieving Holly of the watch, which is the symbol of her alternate future, is what ultimately defeats evil and brings her back to John. And, you can look at that and go, ooh, reactionary messages, bad, 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 bad. Or you can look at it the way you would look at something in Shakespeare or Chaucer and go, wow, how beautifully put together that is. And you can do both things. That's really the amazing part of it. You can actually have both reactions, and I do.
That's the walking and chewing gum of adulthood, isn't it? The ability to
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I've mentioned this on the podcast, but it's certainly something I suggested on Twitter is we get away from saying but all the time and start saying and as a conjunction.
Yes.
So
yes.
this can be true and this can be true. And you don't have to even establish a but as a sort of mitigating sort of effect that one statement will have on the other, or subordinate one statement to another.
I've actually thought that, if at some point I'm going to put together an anthology of reviews, and I'm one of the possible titles I thought of was At the Same Time. At the Same Time. And the reason I would choose that is I was looking back, over my archive of stuff, which is like 30 plus years of writing. And I realized I use that phrase a lot. And I use that phrase as a way of reaching out to the reader and saying, this movie is this, and at the same time, it's this. And I like that construction because it indicates that I like to think of it as like two works of art that are transparent, that are superimposed over each other to make another thing. It's that kind of, that Godardian sort of, it's like the dialectical notion of editing and storytelling, where it's, you allow these things to be in conflict, you allow them to be in tension, you allow them to coexist and even merge, but they remain separate things. It's not like you're creating a third thing out of it. They get to have their own integrity. And Spike Lee is great at that. Spike Lee is an absolute master at that, and to a point where I think it's hurt him commercially. Where his movies are extremely sensitive in some ways and extremely insensitive in others, and very forward-thinking in certain ways and very backwards in others, and all of these things coexist.
Yeah, we can have it in other art forms. We can have the music and the lyrics of opera. We can have the dance and the movement and the staging in ballet. And movies, if anything, just has so many more moving parts. It's going to be so much more complex in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I also like it when there's a scene in a movie where the character that you kind of identify with and root for, despite how sort of abominable they are in certain ways, that, sometimes there will be a scene where a character who represents the naysayers in the audience will come in and say, that's bad. What you're doing is horrible. And you get to see the character kind of brush them off. And then I like, and those scenes when they're badly done, they can sort of seem like the academic sort of predictable Sunday supplement sort of critic is coming in and chastising the hero. But when it's well done, it kind of throws it back into the audience's lap and says, we have acknowledged what a piece of crap this person is, and are you still rooting for them? And if the answer is yes,
I remember Walter Chow making that point about Eddie Murphy's response to Nick Nolte in After Hours, where Nick Nolte tries to apologize for his racist language, and Eddie Murphy sort of says, not good enough, really. He's I'm not going to let you off the hook. I'm not just going to go, yep, that's fine.
Right. And also that's another thing. Movies. There's so many cliches in movies, particularly Hollywood movies. And one of them is the idea that somebody can be an absolutely horrible person for their whole life, and then they do one heroic thing and all is forgiven. And probably it's still the most notorious comical example to me is Darth Vader in Return of the Jedi. It's like he saves his own son. Well, okay, but who wouldn't do that?
Is that where the bar? That's where the bar is.
It's like, you don't think Hitler would have done that? And we're basically talking about space Hitler. here. You know,
Absolutely.
like, that's okay. I guess he was still, there was still some decency left in him. It's like, well, tell it to the people of Alderaan, you know.
But it's a sign of how convincing that film is as well, that you don't really care. You're willing to shed a tear.
Yes, exactly.
As John Williams plays the Imperial March on a slow harpsichord.
exactly. Boy, that's a whole other thing. John Williams. Gosh, what can you say about John Williams? He just had a birthday recently. What is he, like 80 now or 85? I think he's.
Oh yeah, I think it's heading towards Clint Eastwood age, isn't he?
He's what a machine, and I believe he's finally retired. I think I read that The Fabelmans was his last score, and but that's somebody who, he has an identity as strong as any director. And I'll never forget, my son was about 10 or 11, and I said, well, you want to watch a movie tonight? And he said, yeah. And I said, what do you want to watch? And he said, I want to watch a John Williams movie. And I got confused for a second, and I said, a John Williams movie? What do you mean? And he said, like Star Wars or Harry Potter or Jaws, and I realized, oh my God, there are certain types of movies, these fantasy and action and genre films that have John Williams scores. And my son thought of those as John Williams movies. And they kind of are.
I'd like to see an Ennio Morricone movie any day of the week.
Well, yeah. And in fact, those are two composers, I would say, who have such strong personalities and are in such command of their craft that the music often fools me into thinking a movie's better than it is. Like, what was that movie by Giuseppe Tornatore, the movie with Monica Bellucci?
Milena? Was it Milena?
Milena, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of a terrible movie. I'm just going to say it. I mean, it's beautifully directed and everything about it is great, except the movie, I think, is really, really specious and kind of weak in a lot of ways. But that score, oh my God, that score. And I came out of it thinking thinking I'd seen something, and I realized it was just the score that did that. It's really kind of a mess. And I think there's been a few others that he scored that, like, I think The Untouchables is half the movie without that score. Like, if you'd had somebody like Dave, if Dave Grusin had done the score of The Untouchables, and I like him fine on other films, but we wouldn't be talking about it today. It's that oomph that he brought.
He's got so many. I mean, like, could you have that long, drawn out sort of slow motion waiting at the central railway station without Ennio Morricone scoring it? It just feels.
No, you can't. You can't. And I just watched The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It was on one of the cable stations a couple of nights ago, and I watched most of it, and it was chopped up for commercials, and it was pan and scan, and it was kind of miserable knowing what it actually looks and sounds like. And yet, there's that phrase again. I watched the whole thing. And
yes.
that final sequence that begins with Tuco running around in the cemetery looking for Art Stanton's gravestone, and Ennio Morricone's score hits this peak of hysteria, and it's that sequence is so beautiful, and there, you talk about it, and yet, or an at the same time, like, to me that's a sequence where, to me, what's going on, like, as a viewer, is I'm seeing you've just come out of that whole Civil War sequence, which is about the tremendous epic waste of human life that's going on all around these guys.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
who were looking for gold. And Tuco doesn't care about any of that. He just wants to find the gravestone where the gold is contained. But the scene is also kind of this lament for the sheer scale of the suffering. And the fact that you've got this guy who's really his only concern is money running around in there. Like, he's not thinking, oh, the humanity. But I feel like the movie is.
Yes.
The movie is, in some strange way.
Was it? I think Christopher Frayling said that Sergio Leone's movies are operas in which the arias are stared rather than sung.
I love that phrase.
Final sequence is totally that.
I love that. I'm so glad that you quoted that, because that phrase has been in my head for several months and I couldn't remember where I saw it. But that's perfect. Absolutely perfect. And they are operas, and operas, bringing it back to operas. I mean, how many of the great operas are based around basic stories that would not stand up to the scrutiny of an editorial page columnist who is looking at mainly at the morals?
Oh, she's got TB. Is that it? She's just going to cough and die. Is that all she's going to do? That's so passive.
Yes. And also just, so many of the operas based on mythology are, they're unabashedly royalist in their biases and very much buying into, the right of kings and queens to do whatever they want, and God ordaining certain things, and, people being punished for the transgression of not doing what the royal person wants, and all of that. I mean, pretty much almost all of Shakespeare is about that. But if you can't find your own way into it as a viewer, then it's your problem. It's really your problem. And I love, the tragedies of Shakespeare are so much the guide for a lot of the movies that I like. I mean, there's no reason why you should care about Macbeth at all.
Yet he gets the most beautiful speech in Shakespeare. He gets the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech, which as well, just within that speech, even if you don't know anything about the play, the speech itself is saying something which is utterly nihilistic. It's basically the universe makes absolutely no sense, so we can do whatever you like and it doesn't matter. But it says it so beautifully.
It's so illuminating, and it's also, on a basic level, the story of Macbeth it's film noir. It's like the original film noir. It's a guy he's smart and ambitious, but he's not as smart. He's more ambitious than he is smart, and he's got a woman in his life who's way smarter than he is, who sees him as her instrument. And it's really like she's the original femme fatale, and it's funny. And that's the other thing about Shakespeare is he's funny. He's funny, and sometimes he's directly funny, like characters say things that are amusingly phrased, or they catch your attention because they're true. There's something about it that's speaking the truth. But other times they're funny because of the situation. And Macbeth is, I never thought I would say this, but Macbeth is a stitch. It really is. And like, as it goes on, like the guy keeps digging himself deeper and deeper into a hole. And it's like, well, and now we're in even worse trouble. It's like, oh, look at another fine mess you've gotten us into. And the solution is always, well, we got to kill some more people. What about that guy? You haven't killed him yet. Maybe if you kill him, it'll be better now. It's just...
I'm so far waded into blood that it would be as tedious to go back as it would to go forward. Just the fact that he uses tedious, not it would be as difficult, but it would be as boring to go backwards as it would to go forwards. So.
Right. Well, there is a certain point where you're like, why not? Why not? And yeah.
But they're children, sire. Oh, well, we haven't tried children yet. Maybe children will be the answer.
No, that's right. Let's see. What taboo haven't we broken yet?
I mean, speaking of Shakespeare, one of the books that you wrote that I really loved reading was over COVID, I did a rewatch of The Sopranos with my daughter. I used it as an opportunity to sort of read your book chapter by chapter as we went through the episodes. There's a TV show that absolutely merits comparison with Shakespeare, I think. I don't think that's hyperbole.
No, I don't think it. I don't think it is. I don't think it is. That marriage between Tony and Carmela is one of the great marriages of convenience, I guess, in some ways that you've ever seen. And it's so deep. It's so deep and so believable. And the way that they have made peace with each other's heinousness, I was speaking about scenes where a character kind of lays it on the line for you morally, and then you have to decide where you're going to go as a viewer. One of the great scenes in the history of television is the scene where Carmela goes to a different shrink, and he tells her essentially, look, here's the source of your unhappiness. You're married to a criminal. You're married to a murderous, thieving criminal. And all the money that allows you to live so comfortably is blood money, and unless you take your kids and leave this guy, you're never gonna be happy, and also you're a horrible person. Basically, he tells her you're a horrible person, and the only way to solve this is by removing the circumstances that make your behavior horrible. And she doesn't want to hear it. She doesn't want to hear it, and she stays with him, and that's very realistic. And I think what that show got better than probably any drama that's ever been on TV is how probably 99 out of 100 people, when faced with a situation like that, would do the convenient thing. And people on that show are constantly doing the convenient thing instead of the right thing. And that's why they tolerate Ralphie for as long as they do. And it gnaws at Tony. Like, Tony has just enough of a sort of buried, gnarled, misshapen conscience to know that this guy is the devil. But the devil is allowed to live among them. And they just sort of step around him and look the other way. And Gandolfini does some amazing work in all the scenes with Joe Pantoliano, where you can tell that Tony hates this guy. He hates the fact that he even draws breath. And the murder that he committed, all those guys kill people, but the murder he committed was an innocent person, a truly innocent person who reminded Tony of his own daughter. And for money's sake and for the job's sake, he looks the other way until finally he doesn't. And when he finally does get justice for Tracy or revenge against Ralphie, it's strongly suggested that perhaps the thing that Tony thinks he's guilty of, he maybe didn't even do. I mean, I have that argument with people a lot. It's like, did Ralphie burn down the stable? What do you think? Do you think he burned down the stable?
Yeah, I don't think it matters really. I think it's yeah, I don't know. I don't remember having a really strong opinion either way on that. I just assumed that it was a straw, it was or even a straw man, in the sense that it was a motivation that just gave him enough reason to do what he needed to do anyway.
Yeah, well, I think that. And I also think that, given what we know about The Sopranos, the idea of a guy who is guilty of so much being killed for something he didn't do seems very Sopranos to me. That's how I prefer to go. But I love that they don't come down on one side or the other. And in fact, David Chase himself was confused when Alan Sepinwall and I asked him about that plot line. It's like, did Ralphie burn down the stable? And at first he said, well, no. And then he corrected himself and said yes. And then I think he amended himself again. He was like, we told Ralphie that he didn't do it, but doesn't matter, as you say. It doesn't matter for purposes of what happens. It doesn't matter.
Which is that conversation you have with David Chase at the end of the book. You talk about the ending. I think there's a long back and forth with you guys about the ending, because there's this real sense of, it just demands argument. We're demanding closure. We want something out of it that it's not giving us, but at the same time, that is a central point that he's trying to make.
Well, and to me, I love about that final scene is that it flushes out the people who cannot stomach ambiguity. It flushes them out like pheasants from a bush, and they come forward demanding answers and demanding that the mystery be solved, and they cannot seem to sleep at night unless they feel that they know what happened. And a large part of The Sopranos is about not being able to find out what happened. And that's what happens when people get killed is that the people in the mob tell everyone who's still alive they're in witness protection. And it's a very interesting euphemism that they use. It's like, yeah, he's in witness protection now. He's actually at the bottom of a swamp, or he's like chopped up somewhere. But they say, yeah, he's in witness protection, or she went into witness protection. and everyone kind of knows what that meant, but they leave them a little bit of doubt. And sometimes characters on the show actually do go into witness protection.
Just to muddy the waters even further.
Yeah, but there's a lot of things in life that you're just never going to know. You just never know. And I told my daughter years and years ago, I don't remember what the original discussion was about. I said, I like ambiguity in my art and certainty in my life. And she said, well, then you're truly fucked, Dad.
Because it's going to be the other way around.
Yeah, that's not how it works.
I mean, I think it's also that thing of sort of knowing but being able to not know that you know, if you know what I mean. It's sort of like now it seems to be the recent events in globally have been situations in which we've found out what we already know, and now we can't deny it anymore, you know?
Yes. And there's also, there's so many instances where we know full well what's actually going on, but the people who are perpetrating it deny it or obscure it or otherwise mess with our perceptions. I just recently was reading a story about a book banning, an effort to ban so-called offensive books from schools. And a lot of them aren't even offensive at all. They're just reminding people of unpleasant truths about American life. That's the real point of this, is they want to suppress knowledge of the horrible things that have been done in America for hundreds of years. And the group that's spearheading the book banning is called Moms for Liberty. Moms, like that's a Sopranos level name, wouldn't you say? Moms for Liberty. What do you do? I'm the head of a group called Moms for Liberty. What do you do? We ban books. We get books removed from libraries.
Terry Gilliam is writing the present day. It's like Children of Men has become a documentary. We're no longer.
Yes. Well, but how many times have you found that? You read a news story and it's about like some group is spearheading like an opposition to a public housing project or affordable housing, and it turns out it's a multi-billion-dollar real estate consortium, and they're doing a grassroots, what do they call it, an AstroTurf campaign, like a fake grassroots campaign. The group is something like Citizens for Housing Justice.
It reminds me of because Sarah Huckabee Sanders is now relaxing child labor laws, and I just keep thinking of that scene in Zoolander where Magotu says, "I'm a little baby and I want to work. These politicians won't let me." And it's just every time I see this, I think Zoolander did that because it was absurd and hilarious, and now we've actually got mainstream politicians pushing this as the future of like, let's get the children back to work.
I live in Texas, which is one of the states in the U.S. that is what is called a right to work state. And right to work is another wonderful phrase, because right to work basically means right to fire. That's what that means. It's a right to fire state. It's a state with fewer worker protections, not more. So it's not that nobody really cares about somebody's right to work in the state of Texas. What they care about is the employer's right to fire.
Exactly.
Yes. And hire whoever they want and not have to observe, very many regulations. But it's incredible how language can be, even sometimes if it's like blindingly obvious language in its attempts to manipulate you, people still kind of fall for it on some level. Like a lot of the restrictions, the enabling of surveillance after 9/11 and the removal of a lot of basic privacy protections. The surveillance state as we know it was really created by this piece of legislation, which was named the USA Patriot Act. Brilliant name, brilliance in naming. Because now you can't even object to it without people saying, you're really against the USA Patriot Act? Really? Yeah, I mean, they could have had they should have. I mean, they could go further and have turn baby. See, babies are acceptable potted meat material now, and it could be the Baby Protection Act of 2023.
George Orwell is called. He wants his ideas all back.
He wants them all back. Well, but that's another thing is the reactionaries have claimed Orwell now too, which I find doubly ironic. It's like you read something like the National Review and people are constantly saying, well, it's very Orwellian. And it's like, no, you know what is very Orwellian? You guys.
Absolutely. And your freedom fries.
Oh my God, freedom fries. That was like I was so embarrassed to be an American when they did that. We're not calling them French fries anymore. We're calling them freedom fries. And what an insult! What an insult to the French! I tell you, the French have been the best friend, really, honest, truly, the best friend the United States has had globally, because they're not always on our side. When we're full of shit, if they think we're full of shit, they tell us. That's a real friend.
That's what, yeah, exactly. That's what where are you going with that shirt? That's the sort of person you want.
Exactly. Yes. France is the ally that says, you're not really wearing that, are you?
One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you as well, Matt, was you've got your enterprise of your bookshop as well. Tell me about the bookshop where you're actually, hosting some of my best guests' work.
Yeah, I was looking at your list of guests, and it's like there's like 12 people whose books we've not only carried but aggressively promoted because they're great books.
You should make a John Bleasdale Writers on Film corner.
You know what? I wouldn't rule it out, actually. But mzs.press is the address, and it's an online bookstore. It's run by myself and my partner Judith Carter, and it's an arts bookstore. We call it the arts bookstore of the internet, and it's just books about the arts. It's film and television and music and visual art. We have a kids section. We have a section on disability. We have a section on the self. And a lot of other sections, and we're constantly expanding it. And it's new books, it's recent books, but it's also older titles. And I used to work, when I was in college, I had multiple jobs. And one of them was I worked at the college bookstore. And another one was I worked at the Southwest Film Archives. This was at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And so I do have the mentality of, the nice way to say it would be an archivist, and the not nice way would be to say pack rat. And I have hundreds and hundreds of books myself that I've been traveling around with for decades. My children growing up basically felt like they were living in a bookstore because I had so many books. And the bookstore is kind of an extension of that. And I'm the sort of person who will tell people about a book, and then often I would loan them my copy, and sometimes I got it back and sometimes I didn't. But I always wanted to make sure that we have we have some big ticket items, so we have some rare signed books that are, hundreds of dollars and stuff. But most of the books, probably I would say 85 to 90% of it is used books. And we do that very intentionally because I want somebody who is in high school or college who's curious, who wants to get a book about some subject that interests them, to not have to feel like they got robbed, So we have stuff that's like it's a few dollars. We have a whole section of under $20 books, and but I love it. And it's complicated. Retail is complicated, and dealing with customers is complicated. And the post, and I know people at the post office better than I know most of my friends at this point.
A regular customer.
Yeah. So regular that like when we have a big weekend and we've got like 30 or 40 or 50 books and we're pulling them in on a dolly that have to be mailed out. Like I always joke that I expect them to, they see us coming through the window and they put the grates down and say, nobody's here. No one's here today.
I thought you were going to say they open another window especially for you. They have a window.
See, that's where they should go. That's where they should be going with this eventually. But yeah, it's kind of great when you're in line at the post office with a bunch of books that you're sending out to people all over the U.S. and the world, and someone will start a conversation with you, and you'll tell them about the bookstore, and then give them the address, and then like later that afternoon they've ordered a book, and it's often it's a book you forgot you was even in inventory, which is really cool. There have been times we have so many books now that it's like there are times where somebody orders a book and Judith and I will look at each other and go, we have that? And then we go find it, and it's like, yeah, we do. It's like we have one copy, but here it is.
Next to the Ark of the Covenant and the sled with Rosebud written on it.
That's exactly it. Yeah. No, but it's kind of getting people to. I want to try to get people out of their comfort zone, and I'm not. I'm trying to split the difference between, like, I don't want to go too far. I don't want to be one of those, like, I try not to come at it from the position of, I can't believe you haven't seen this already, or I can't believe you don't know about this book, because that to me seems very aggressive and off-putting and kind of crappy to do to people. Like, I don't like that response on social media. It's like, I just watched Bonnie and Clyde for the first time, and there's somebody in the responsible going, what took you so long?
Yeah.
It's like, why do you want to turn a good thing into a bad thing? Why would you say something like that? Like, a better answer is, and what did you think of it?
Yeah.
You know,
or even I wish I could watch that for the first time.
exactly.
How does it play now? Because when I watched it, it was the 1980s, so it played different to how I'm sure it plays today.
Yeah, I would think so. I would think so. And you know, and also the thing is, like, we as buffs of one type or another, we tend to get locked into our little pea brains, and we think that the world of art that we inhabit is the world that everyone else inhabits. And there are people out there who don't know who Spielberg is.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
They don't know who George Lucas. I mean, some of the most popular directors of all time. There are people who don't know who Alfred Hitchcock is. They don't know who John Ford is, and why would they? They're working 60 hours a week.
Yeah.
You know, they're working 60 hours a week, and arts education in this country has been pretty much destroyed during my lifetime. And that's another reason for having this bookstore, is to kind of try to reintroduce people to kind of a common language of culture, and think about it like, instead of an algorithm, we have, I always say, like, we should have like what you call a book concierge or something, because that's what bookstores used to be. Bookstores and movie theaters and video stores too, where, you know, I used to love going to the video store, and I would rent a particular movie, and the person behind the desk was often a movie buff. Why wouldn't, you know, what kind of person would work at a video store if they didn't love movies? You know, they were all movie buffs of one kind or another, and they would say, "Oh, if you like this, have you seen this Japanese film that has the same plot?" And I'd say no, and they're like, "Well, we have it over there," and I'll go rent it. And now I'm a fan of that director. So
absolutely, so many consequential sort of decisions I've made, and turns I've made because of a librarian or someone in a bookshop. I remember someone just suggesting I read what was the book? Because I was always a huge science fiction fan, and they went, "Oh, you'll like this," and gave me One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I thought, this isn't science fiction. Why would I possibly like this? And I read it and just thought, oh my God, what am I doing reading science fiction? I should be reading this kind of thing. And it was just, you know, it's just an old lady in a bookshop saying, time for you to move on to something like this. And it was perfect.
And there's also the joy of just stumbling upon something by yourself.
Mm.
And what I used to do, and I still do it, is in bookstores, I will be in a section. I'll spend some time in a section, and I'll just randomly pull books and look at them and read the back summary, and if the summary seems interesting, I'll open it up to the first page and start reading. And if I'm still reading after 10 pages, I buy the book. I still do that. And you know, I think my first experience that I remember where that happened was, there was a book by Theodore Wiesner called The Car Thief, and I think it came out in like 1970 or 71. And it's literally just about a car thief. He's a teenage car thief, and it's a guy who is, you know, in a kind of a bad home life situation, and he's you know, kind of what you would call an at-risk youth, and it's a very realistic story. There's no genre film elements. It's not like he gets involved in robbing an armored car or anything. He's just a sad ass 19-year-old kid, you know. And I never heard of this author. I'd never heard of this book, and it's one of my favorite novels. And if I hadn't just randomly pulled it off the shelf, I wouldn't know about it.
There has to be going back to our discussion about 2001: A Space Odyssey, serendipity you have to have space in your life for that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's what all the great, not just the great film directors, but I think all of the great artists who work in collaboration do, which is you create a controlled environment in which accidents can happen, and inspirations can happen. And you know, how many of the great moments in movies did not come from the script or from the director? They came from a suggestion by somebody. And one of the directors who I think is more open to that than almost anyone is David Lynch. I love the fact that the actor who played Bob on Twin Peaks was not even an actor, and he saw him like behind a piece of furniture and was like, that guy's face is really unnerving, and he ends up casting him. He ends up creating a character and casting him, and that's a sign of that's a truly healthy ego, to be able to do something like that, where you're not threatened by someone else's idea, you know, just because it's not your idea. There are a lot of directors who would never do something like that, and there are a lot of directors who don't even want anybody below the line to talk to them. You know, they're very, very against anybody else having a say. And And yeah, I'm sure it could get annoying if everybody thinks they're the director. That could impede the production of the movie. But there's this whole middle ground. There's this whole middle ground of I love the story of on Scarface, the final shootout in Scarface. One of the low angle shots of the goons racing to kill Tony Montana, that came about because Spielberg visited the set that day, and he's like, "You should put a camera on the floor here. You might get a really interesting angle." And De Palma's like, "Thanks, Steven Spielberg," and he did it. He wasn't like, "Get off my set. Stop telling me how to direct," Although I'm sure it helps if it's Spielberg. It helps if it's Spielberg instead of your Uncle Earl, but still.
I love those stories of directors helping other directors out. There's a good one on The Spy Who Loved Me. The guy who was directing that, I think it was Lewis Gilbert, might be his name. Anyway, he was an old English director, and his eyesight was failing him. And he and the huge set that had been built for the submarine battle at the end, he couldn't light it because he basically couldn't see the depth that was required for him to light it. And Kubrick was on shooting The Shining next door, and one of the director called him up and said, "You've got to help me with this." And he said, "Okay, have a long lunch, close down your set, and I don't want anyone on the set to know about it being me." And he went in and he lit it for him. And
my God!
Just think, Stanley Kubrick worked as a gaffer on a James Bond movie.
I love that. I love that story, actually. And as you probably know, because you're writing a book about Terrence Malick, if you study the credits of Terrence Malick's movies, you see the names of a lot of people who would later become important in the film industry or were already important, and they're in their working crew.
Yeah.
Just to say they worked on a Terrence Malick movie. Like, I can't remember an example right now, but I know there were several in the credits of The New World where I was like, wait a second, that person's made 3 movies, and it's like, assistant cameraman.
Andrew Dominic. Andrew Dominic shoots second unit on The New World, and he'd already made Chopper. He was already sort of a director, He hadn't made. I don't think he'd made Jesse James yet, but yeah, he was. Yeah. I've been reading your reviews of the. In fact, you're gonna feature quite heavily in the later chapters of the book. As the critical reception of his works becomes increasingly, shall we say, divided. Because I have to hold my hand up and say, when I watched those films, To the Wonder, I was still very much on board, and then Night of Cups and Song to Song, I was finding him difficult, and there was an overwhelming critical narrative of this guy has lost the plot. I think David Thompson wrote something about him in the biographical dictionary of cinema, which was very, no, never in the history of mankind has one fallen from such a height. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but I've been
but not by much.
But I've been looking at you and obviously rewatching the films and trying to get through to them and appreciating them much more, guided by yourself and several others. Richard Brody, I think, is a big champion of those later films as well.
Yeah, I think so. And I also think about, there's a line, and I'm paraphrasing, but I think about it all the time in relation to Malick, which is, it was several years ago. I think it was when Night of Cups or Song to Song came out or something. And Nick Pinkerton, the film comment writer, said basically he really didn't like how there was, every time Malick had a new movie out, there were like, people would go on social media and act like they'd been personally attacked by Terrence Malick, and they talked about it like they were Marvel films. Like, I'm so sick of this kind of movie, and it's like, he's one guy. There's like nobody else who makes movies like this, and he doesn't. And it's not like he's making one a month. And if you don't like it, just don't watch it. Just don't watch it. Like, it's not that hard. And I love Malick's films for a lot of reasons, and one of them is that he has this kind of transcendentalist moonchild sort of sensibility where he's always, as my friend Dave puts it, Malick is always open to the possibility of rapture. And some of the best scenes in his movies are about people experiencing extraordinary moments of catharsis or appreciation of beauty or feeling like they have a place in the universe. And it's often not a big, obviously dramatic moment. It's something very quiet. And, people looking at looking at the ocean, looking at the sun, looking at plants, looking at animals and things. And Malick is, among his other reasons to love Malick, is how many major directors even notice nature anymore? I mean, really notice nature. I don't mean you park the camera, there's some mountains and you park the camera and get a shot of the mountains. I don't mean that. I'm talking about like the way Malick will cut to an insect on a blade of grass or a butterfly or a deer in the meadow or something. And sometimes he'll give you like a sequence of shots that show flora and fauna before he'll get into the human action. And it's a way of sort of humbling us a little bit, and that line in The New World, why does nature war with itself? Like when I first saw that, I thought, boy, he's finally disappeared into his own navel with that one. And then I thought about it some more and I thought, no, he's right. He's right. Like humans are a part of nature, and when they war with each other, it's nature warring with itself. It's actually not that complicated of a concept, but it's not something that movies normally think to say.
This is the weird thing, is that the Terrence Malick negative review has become like a genre in and of itself. It's like every time a new film comes out, it's like, oh, okay, how can I compare this to a perfume ad? Let me count the ways, and criticism sort of stops doing its job at that point. So a lot of the criticisms that you get, for instance, there's no story. Actually, if there is a problem with his last 3 or 4 movies, it's been that there's been too much story. I mean, it's a very obliquely told story, but you can't watch song to song and say there's no story in there. There are 3 different love stories going on in totally different directions. If anything, it's chocker.
Yes, that's true. And I think A Hidden Life is one of his best films. I think, and that's the one that I think in some ways is the summation of everything he's about, because you get the pre-aughts Terrence Malick, like the pre-Tree of Life Terrence Malick, or where would you say that it's hard to say exactly where this sort of modern Malick style began, but I feel like it was probably To the Wonder. I think you could see inklings of it in the Tree of Life, but in any case, there are self-contained scenes with beginnings, middles, and ends in The Hidden Life, and then there's also that kind of montage-driven style of filmmaking that he does, where it's very literally free associative, like one image inspiring the placement of another image, and it creates a feeling rather than an argument a lot of the time, And yeah, Hidden Life is great, and it's also just a great. He's so good to his actors. You really have to. I would imagine you really got to trust him and vibe with him to do your best work with Malick. But somebody who understands Malick, like they kind of get what he needs, does really well. Like I thought Ryan Gosling and Michael Fassbender did very well for him.
Yeah, I agree.
I think they understood, that where they kind of at one point, like Michael Fassbender, starts imitating an ape.
Yes.
And I thought that was so beautiful. Because that's actually, I could see Malick standing off to the side, smiling, going, "Yeah, man, this is what I wanted.
This is the good stuff.
This is the good stuff right here. Yeah." And Ben Affleck gave an interview years ago after he'd done To the Wonder, where he was, I couldn't tell if he was describing or complaining. Sometimes it's hard to tell from these articles, but he said something to the effect of the thing about shooting with Terry is you'll be having a conversation with your co-star and you think the camera's on you, but it turns out it swung to the left to follow a squirrel as it climbed up a tree. And I read that and I thought, okay, well, if you're making a list of reasons why Terrence Malick is awesome, then that's a thing that would happen. Like, who else would do that? I mean, it is like the dog in that Pixar movie is like squirrel. There is a little bit of that.
Well, let me just ask you one last question, Matt. Give us a book recommendation. I know that's an impossible one for you, but we like having some book recommendations. So a film book, if you please.
Well, Isaac Butler's The Method, I think, is terrific, and it just won the National Book Critics Circle Award for nonfiction. And it's kind of a history of method. It's the history and development of the modern style of acting. And a lot of it's about Stanislavski, but it kind of continues on beyond that. And that's a really not just an impeccably researched book, but it's one of those books where you feel like you're watching a movie. You feel like you're watching like Amadeus or something. Like the characters really come alive. It's just a wonderful piece of writing. And Dana Stevens' Cameraman is terrific, about Buster Keaton, and it's not a biography strictly speaking. But it does sort of give you a sense of his place in history and aesthetically what he was all about. And then of older books, I think Michael Benson's 2001 book is a great one I would recommend because so many people have seen that movie. And so, you're not asking people to read a book about a movie they haven't seen. And the anecdotes and lessons that are included in that book can apply to almost any movie that you can think of, including things that have nothing to do with science fiction. It's a great insight into the filmmaking process, and it's in paperback and you can pick it up used. So
excellent.
Those are three to start with.
Superb. Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And it was an honor to be on this momentous podcast. Thank you for asking me.
$1-800-Flowers.com knows that a gift is never just a gift. A gift is an expression of everything you feel and helps to build more meaningful relationships. 1-800-Flowers takes the pressure off by helping you navigate life's important moments by making it simple to find the perfect gift. From flowers and cookies to cake and chocolate, 1-800-Flowers helps guide you in finding the right gift to say how you feel. To learn more, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Hey, it's Mark Marin from WTF here to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. And I'm sure the reason you're listening to this podcast right now is because you chose it. Well, choose Progressive's Name Your Price tool, and you could find insurance options that fit your budget, so you can pick the best one for your situation. Who doesn't like choice? Try it at Progressive.com. And now, some legal info. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.